So, hi all. Thank you, David, so much for coming to this follow-up interview. It's a follow-up on the Zoom about the law of crime concentration and place-based prevention, and you will see the link to the Zoom talk below. So I encourage you, if you have not looked at it yet, to look at it. And we will jump right up to the questions. So, David, can you please summarize your research findings for a layman?
Sure. First of all, I want to say I enjoyed very much your speaking and getting lots of good questions and thoughtful ideas about the work.
Thank you.
In terms of an explanation for a layman, first of all, I would encourage people to look at a book that was written by Malcolm Gladwell called Talking to Strangers, in which he does a very good job of sort of laying out the implications of the work I've done for understanding crime, for doing something about crime. But I think and I know that my talk in your seminar was a bit different, that I talked about the general development of my work and not just about a single piece. But I think the best way to understand what I've become interested in is to contrast it with the way we ordinarily think of the crime problem. For the last 100 years, when scholars and lay people as well have understood the crime problem, they've tried to deal with it and think about it using two images. One image is of offenders. Crime is about who did it, and our job is to identify them and prosecute them and sanction them, and that's the key to understanding and doing something about the crime problem. And another approach is to think about communities. There are bad communities out there. There are places, delinquency areas, and places that are just not good. And all those places, that whole area is just problematic. And those have been the predominant ways people think about the crime problem. And I think both scholars and lay people. My work focuses in on a different unit of analysis, if you like, which is small microgeographic places. Hotspots, single street segments with a lot of crime. And that work transforms the way we think about crime and also what we should do about crime. It pushes us to the microgeographies within communities, the micro communities within larger communities, to develop our understanding and to develop our reactions to crime. Behind it all stands a very important observation that I've helped develop, which is what we now call the law of crime concentration, which is that the bulk of crime in a city occurs at a relatively small number of places. 50% of crime in most cities occurs at just 5% of the streets. And by streets, I mean streets intersection to intersection. And that concentration of crime is sort of the first order, the first law of this area of study, which is crime is extraordinarily concentrated. Why is that? And how can we take advantage about that to do something about the crime problem?
That's very interesting. So if I understand you correctly, these have immediate advices for policymakers interested in reducing the crime rate in their region, right?
Look, the key to all this is focus. The FBI, in talking about my work once I saw, said that you don't fish in places where there are no fish. So most of the city doesn't have any crime, most of the streets. And when I talk about 5% of the streets having 50% of the crime, they're not all in one neighborhood, those hotspots. They're spread throughout the city. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, if you want to do something about the crime problem, why would you waste your resources by spreading your resources across the whole city? Shouldn't you focus those resources on where crime is concentrated? And since the concentration is so great, there are often streets with hundreds of crimes in a year, you can have a large impact on the crime problem by focusing on a very small proportion of the streets in the city.
So maybe a tough question. What are the main obstacles? Or in other words, why do you think your suggestions are not implemented? Or maybe they are implemented, but not in a strong enough way. Am I correct?
Yeah,
maybe I'm wrong.
First of all, the in surveys of American police agencies, for example, most police agencies use some sort of hotspotting. In other words, they analyze the data in their city to find out where crime is concentrated. The barriers to this sort of work are the following. First of all, many times when cities talk about hotspots, they're actually not talking about hotspots as I think about it. They're talking about larger areas. A whole community is a hotspot in the city, and that's wrong. So one barrier I think is that recognizing the micro nature of this all doesn't seem to be as easy as you would imagine. In other words, it takes some thinking to get down to the idea that, hey, we ought to focus on that place and that place. But I think the biggest barrier to this sort of approach is what I sometimes call the boogeyman of place-based prevention, is the idea of displacement. I think we all have, I think it's very common academically, it emerged in the 1970s and 80s as a very strong idea. But we all ought to have this idea that if we push down on a specific spot, crime is just going to move around the corner. So a common reflection of police who don't want to take this approach is, well, what's the point of this? If we go after this hotspot, crime is just going to move around the corner. It turns out the science says that's not true. Though crime can move around the corner, in most cases it doesn't. And that has to do with getting a deeper understanding of what's going on at these hotspots. For example, juvenile crime is often centered around juvenile activity spaces like malls or stores with games and things of this sort, or bus stops near schools and these sorts of places. And if you think about that, for example, the malls, there might be a lot of juvenile activity and negative juvenile activity as well in these places. But if you look around those malls, they don't have the same opportunities. They're not the same sorts of places. There's often in many cities, single family homes. Well, that's not going to get the same type of activity. They're not going to become juvenile crime hotspots. So, and also I should note, there's a sort of human element to this, or a social element. It turns out that offenders, like the rest of us, don't move so easily, right? They get comfortable where they are. I always say that people think twice before they go to a certain haircutter. They don't want change. They want things to be, they want a known world. Well, criminals want a known world. They want to know where it's safe to commit crime. They want to know who the good guys and the bad guys are. The good guys being the people that won't call the police on them. And the bad guys, the people that will call the police. They want how dangerous that spot is for them. Anyway, for offenders as well, there's a social element that they moving where you commit crime is uncomfortable. So once they focus in on a place, develop, if you like, their business at that place or their range of activities, it's not as easy as you would think to move. Indeed, it seems like it's pretty hard for them in many places to move, or in many situations to move. Part of that is the movement demands a greater effort. You have to restart your customer base. It's more dangerous. There might be people there who will call the police on you, etc. And to some extent, as one prostitute once told us in a study we did about displacement, when asked about why she didn't move to an area nearby where there was also prostitution, and she said, "Those are not my type of girls. I don't feel comfortable there." So my point is that this displacement idea, this idea that somehow whenever we push down on a hotspot, it's just going to move the crime around the corner, has been a sort of important resistance, an element of resistance to this sort of hotspot or place-based prevention. But nonetheless, as I noted at the beginning, there are a lot of police agencies in the US and around the world that have begun to adopt these hotspots policing strategies. I seem to have lost you.
Oh, sorry. And now? So can I say, we had some internet connection problem, sorry about it. Can I say that basically it's based on cost-benefit analysis in a sense? My cost of doing business in other place is higher and the benefit might be lower. So I prefer to be in the place I am in.
I think that's part of it. I think that a lot of the work around in this area, in terms of understanding the offenders, revolves around rational choice theory and cost-benefit analysis and opportunity theories. You know, the crimes are occurring in those spots because there are opportunities. They're occurring in those spots because there's not enough guardianship to deter them. They're occurring in those spots because people are going there, and that's part of the opportunity structure. So rational choice, cost-benefit analysis, economic ideas about crime are very important in this thinking about crime hotspots and how they can help us do something about the crime problem. But that's not the whole story. We found, for example, that the social structure of places also affects that, if you want to call it opportunity structure, but affects that the ability of those places, those places becoming crime hotspots. We found that places where residents are more connected to each other, are more willing to be involved in doing something about problems, also are likely to have, are less likely to be crime hotspots. So I think I think you have to include here not only a traditional rational choice set of thinking about these places in terms of the offenders, but also a more sociological idea of informal social control in terms of the people who live on these streets.
I see. And following this idea, what is your thought about increasing the cost for the crime makers? And for example, using artificial intelligence like surveillance cameras. Will it work, in your opinion?
Look, once you arrive at the idea that these hotspots, that you want to focus in on this relatively small number of streets that have a lot of crime, and you focus in on the idea that opportunity structure, these places have opportunities for crime, then the question becomes, what can you do about it? And obviously, there's been a series of randomized trials now that show that if you bring police to those areas and create deterrence, you'll lower the levels of crime. By the way, if you send police and encourage them to deal with the underlying sorts of problems or opportunities that are causing those problems, you'll also get a benefit. But I just want to note something. To some degree, there are some places that are just always going to be attracted to crime, and ending all those attractions may not be what you want to do. Because, for example, shopping areas, we want people to come to shopping. We want them to congregate. We want them to buy things. We want them to bring money. So we could get rid of the hotspot just by closing down businesses. But that's not, or the department stores, that's not the solution we want. So there's a balance here between the opportunity structure, some of which creating positive outcomes, and those at the same time creating negative outcomes, and doing something about the crime problem by adding police presence or other sorts of activities that will not reduce those opportunities, but create deterrence for offenders at those places. Now, the issue of artificial intelligence is interesting. I was in China a bit ago, and they wanted to show me this company that was there. I was visiting a college, but this company wanted to show me all the innovations they were developing in the area of surveillance and artificial intelligence. And the way they showed it to me was when I got into their headquarters, which was typically this 40-story brand new office building. But I got into the headquarters where they had this beautiful layout of what they were doing and the innovations they were creating. They showed me that they had tracked me from the time I woke up in the morning and left the hotel to when I got into the building. And they were very keen on it. And I said, I'm not sure if I were you, I would push this too much, because this is sort of a kind of invasion of privacy that people in the West would not be very happy about. But at the same time, what showed you how these technologies could develop, once they knew who I was, if you like, they could follow me around with cameras that were now placed throughout the city, which was a test city for them. But they also wanted at that point, they were delving into the area of artificial intelligence and merging it sort of with the hotspots idea, if you like. In other words, there are places where there are more problems. What happens if we put lots of cameras at those places and we use artificial intelligence to identify when the police had to be there? Now, I think that what's important here is cameras are useful to some degree, but quite often after the crime has been committed. Because if you had a camera on 20,000 streets, it would cost a fortune to have human beings observe 20,000 cameras, right? So cameras, quite often, you could have cameras right there and people commit crimes because, no one's watching the cameras, or they can't watch all the cameras, if you like. So what they wanted to do was to use artificial intelligence to create algorithms for when there are indicators that something bad is about to happen. So you can imagine kids on the block, they start fighting talking in a certain way, and the artificial intelligence flag that and say, this is a problem, and now we're going to send police there. So I think the artificial intelligence in that sense has a tremendous potential. The problem up till now is no one has been able to break down behavior cues to the point where the artificial intelligence can be accurate enough to figure it out, if you like, to figure out those cues and say the number of false positive here was very high in what they were doing, and I assume is still very high. There's potential here. If their cameras were in hotspots, and those cameras could alert the police 10 minutes before something was going to happen, that, of course, would be a major advance. I don't know if anybody else besides the Chinese are working on it.
I think Ido tried to do something similar in Israel. I'm not sure if he told you about it, but
he did mention it. But yeah, Ido and I should talk more about this sort of thing. But my impression from the Chinese was this is very hard to develop an algorithm that will work.
Yes, definitely, it's hard, but maybe what you're saying is very optimistic, because maybe what we thought was very hard 5 years ago, now it's already implemented, and maybe in a few years such algorithms will be implemented. And
maybe so, but that would demand a kind of investment in social inquiry that I don't think is occurring in the crime world. In other words, I always say that there's $45 billion a year invested in health research in the US, and about $200 million in crime research by the federal government. So you can't do that much with only $200 million across the vast array of the criminal justice system.
Wow, given your amount of grants that you got, now this sounds even more impressive. As far as I remember, you got more than $15 million of grants over years. So given the budget that is allocated to the crime research, now this number sounds even more impressive in proportion.
Well, let's put it this way, that I've been lucky to get support for my work. It hasn't always been easy because the work is looking in new directions, but I have been successful along the way. But the issue here is not necessarily, I should note, the amount of grants you have, because there are many times grants are given for the same thing over and over again, or for things that all of a sudden are hot in the public environment. Focusing in on a long-term research agenda can be more difficult. My point is that if we wanted to conquer this AI problem, and I'm not sure the people who develop these algorithms really understand this, we'd need to understand better the social cues and other issues that surround these places. We also would need to understand, what places we should focus on. Actually, we know an awful lot about that at the moment.
And talking about social cues, but from a different perspective, what do you think, going to the artificial intelligence, if in the crime scene or a place like that, there will be a sign for those who are in this place that the police will come in a few minutes? Will it help?
Signage, there's been, some medical studies, some economic studies that signage works, like that telling people that you're going to do something. Of course, it doesn't work if they don't see you come. And carrying out such an agenda would be the problem. I think that it's interesting to me, I proposed a study to with some colleagues in Israel, both I think in Israel, and we proposed it to Washington, D.C., I remember. And the study would be to create cues or reminders about misbehavior at protest marches, at protests. In other words, we were going to try to identify internet sites where people who would be involved in protests would participate, and put cues on the sites. You'd have to pay for it to put cues on those general sites that would remind them about good behavior and remind them about, certain behaviors can lead to arrests, etc. And what struck me at the time was that in Washington, D.C. was when they reacted and said, well, we could get in trouble we don't want to do that. We're worried. In other words, they were worried that would lead to people saying they were working against protests or things of this sort. I don't know. There are lots of I think that once you arrive at the idea that there's a relatively small number of places producing much of the crime problem, and those places tend to be stable in terms of, or relatively stable over time in terms of crime levels, you could think of all sorts of creative solutions to do something about those places. And by the way, the advantage of places is that they have fewer constitutional protections than people, right? If you start going after people, especially people who haven't committed crime, responding to directly, that's a gigantic problem. But places, there's been, I think that overall, courts have been supportive, trying to make places safer by doing things either in terms of creative signage or other things, has not faced the same kinds of problems because the place doesn't have the same type of constitutional rights. So I should be careful. Stores, businesses, etc., people on the street have many rights you have to pay attention to.
Just to clarify, and I agree that this can also work, but what I meant is that based on artificial intelligence, after I see that there is a high probability that will be some crime in a certain area, if then the people see a sign that, okay, now the police is going to come. So basically changing the probability of being caught. Will this, in your opinion, can reduce the crime rate in these hotspots?
Look, I think all of the bringing police, having when police create more presence at a place, if they're being smart, they're also looking at when crime is most likely. So to some degree, this is already happening. Communicating to offenders is very important. By the way, there's another side to this. We found in a controlled study in Jersey City, New Jersey, that I spoke about, that when you crack down on a hotspot, and these were longer than street segments, these were groups of street segments, what happens is the crime at the hotspot goes down. There are lots of studies to show that. But what was interesting in this case was that the areas immediately around the hotspots also got better. Crime went down in those areas as well. And one of the things you have to ask yourself is we were restricting the extra police presence and activities to the hotspot itself. And so why did the areas around it get better? Well, one reason they got better is offenders only have limited rationality. Now, they don't know what the police are thinking and doing. They're making assumptions about that. So to the extent you can create assumptions among offenders that they're going to get caught, or that there's going to be greater police presence, or the prosecutions are going to be more intense, you'll obviously get more deterrence. So the psychological element for offenders is obviously important here. By the way, the reason why places get better around is not only because offenders are deterred and believe, rightly or wrongly, that it's going to come to them as well, but it's also because people in these areas may gain greater strength. In other words, informal social controls may increase as well as the places get better. People may spend more time in the street. They may be more willing to get involved, and that will spread out from the hotspot.
That's very interesting, and I think counterintuitive, this positive spillover effect in a sense, because my intuition might be, or as you spoke at the beginning of this talk, this interview, that maybe if there are less Bulgari in my street, there will be more on the next street. So this is very counterintuitive in a sense. This is interesting what you are saying.
Well, I think you have to put together a set of ideas. We call this, Ron Clark and I, in a paper we wrote a number of years ago, called this the diffusion of crime control benefits, as opposed to displacement of crime. So I think it begins to make sense, and we've done some qualitative research that helps us. When you think about a group of issues, that the idea that somehow crime is just going to move around the corner, first of all, presupposes that around the corner you have the same opportunities for crime. And often you don't. The opportunities are often less. They chose that particular street because it's the main street, because people pass it. If it's a drug market, for example, there's reasons why that particular place is a hotspot, and areas nearby are not going to offer the same opportunities. And offenders on a cost benefit ideas you've already discussed are going to say, well, the benefits there aren't as high. Maybe the costs are a little lower, by the way, if there aren't police there. So one element is that places nearby may not have the same opportunities. A second element is the lack of recognition in the balloon model or the displacement model that that areas nearby might might also entail new learning, new customers, and might entail dangers. Now, in terms of why it gets better, well, that's a kind of it's a harder issue to figure out in a way, but I think relates to these sorts of questions. First of all, some of the people creating the problems are picked up by the police and maybe taken off the street. And that means those people who would also be doing some offending, though less offending in the areas nearby, are now not around. I think a second element is, as I've said before, an element of limited rationality. They don't know that the street next door is not going to have police presence. Now, they may learn about that as time goes on, and then they may adjust their behavior in the long run, by the way. But as I said, I think the atmosphere created by reducing crime, by increased police presence and other issues, by the community getting stronger, by informal social controls being reinforced by the hotspot itself, I think that leads to this sort of radiation of crime control benefits to the areas nearby.
I see. Thank you. And you mentioned in your depth seminar that once a place has been burglarized, it has a higher chance of being burglarized again. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Why is that happening?
Well, I think this relates to the repeat victimization literature, which shows pretty strongly that if you've been victimized once, for example, burglarized once, you're more likely to be burglarized. But I think it has to do with the opportunity structure. If people came to that street to commit crime and decided your house was a good place to do that, a good place to burglarize, and there may be multiple reasons. One might be that there's not much security. The second might be there's a lot to steal. But if you've had a burglary, it means that people are familiar with the area. It means that there are opportunities there that they observed. And that usually means that, it used to be, I think cops would come to people and say, well, it's hit you, it's not going to hit you again, as if lightning doesn't strike twice. It's just completely opposite. Lightning struck there because of a series of reasons, including opportunities, the nature of your security. So what I advise to people is that if you've been burglarized, you ought to up the security at your house. In other words, raise your security one level or two levels, because if you don't, there's a good chance it'll happen again.
That's interesting. So basically, you're saying that it's conditional probability. If you have been burglarized, there is it's increased the chance of being. I see. Okay, going from your research to more general questions, what is your vision for scholars attempting to persuade policymakers to implement specific policies for the benefit of the people, let's say, for 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think that if you're trying to there's two sort of questions for young scholars. One is, how do I advance my scientific career? And the second is, how can I influence policy and practice? So you're starting with the second one, so I'll start there.
If you want to switch it the other way around, that's perfectly fine.
No, I'm fine. I'll go this way. But I think that if you want to make important contributions in this area in terms of doing something about, let's say, the crime problem, I think and maybe the two are more related than I suggested when I first said this. The first thing is that my advice to young people, for example, who are developing their careers in science, are not to get caught up in the vagaries of the moment. Public policy changes, the interest of policymakers change very quickly. For a politician, 2 months is a long time. A year is a very long time, and 2 years is forever. Doing research, those are very short periods of time. Early in my career, we did a study of white-collar crime, and the Congress was interested in the U.S., and they said, we're going to give you as much time as you need. And leading professor Stan Wheeler of the project said, well, how much time is that? And they said, well, a year or two. In academic terms, a year or two is not that long a time. But more importantly, you need to focus in on a set of contributions. You need to, when we write scientific biographies, sometimes I think they're useless promotions and things of that sort. But there is a utility to that, which is there should be a sense of emerging science, of developing ideas, of looking into new ways of thinking. And that doesn't happen if you change your progress every year according to what the vagaries, the interests are of politicians or the public, etc. So one thing I would say is link it to something you think is really important and interesting and keep at it and keep developing it. Now, if you develop it and it has strong policy implications, it may not at the beginning, but if it does, the next question is, well, how do you get it out there? And that requires a whole different set of skills, it seems to me. One thing you have to do is you have to be able to run, in my view, in these kinds of areas, you have to be able to run field trials. You have to be able to show that whatever you're trying to do actually has an effect in the real world. And to do that, you have to be able to work with practitioners. One of the problems in Israel in this sort of research is the sort of barriers between practitioners and researchers. The practitioners often don't recognize the value of researchers. I've worked in this in Israel my whole career, trying to make them value that. I think I've succeeded to some degree. To some degree, I think there are still strong barriers. But that takes a different set of skills. You have to be able to speak a language that people understand in the public or in the practitioners. You have to be able to create relationships with them, because for them to go out and do a randomized trial, for example, involves risk and other issues. You have to convince policymakers of the importance of research, of the importance of evidence-based policy. So on the one hand, I'd say science, focus in on area, keep going. Don't get distracted along the way by what's hot and what's, what's going to get you in the newspapers. Don't worry about getting the newspapers. That's not what's important in science. But the second part is you have to develop relationship. You have to develop culture. You have to speak the language of the people that you're going to be asking to carry out experimental trials or to implement these things in the real world.
It also, I think, one big challenge is that it also requires a lot of resources to run these big field experiments.
Right, that's a tremendous barrier in Israel, where there are very few resources for this sort of research. The Israel Science Foundation, one of the major sources of science funding, is not interested in policy and practice, really, and doesn't fund large evaluations, or at least hasn't to the extent that I've seen. And there's no other group that has. We did a large evaluation of the police. The police actually supported the evaluation. And that's about developing relationships and convincing. I convinced the Mafkal, the General Director of the Police, that if he was going to develop a new program, that a rigorous evaluation should follow. But that involved a relationship with that particular police chief, who issued a solicitation, by the way, which was reviewed, and then I felt lucky that we were chosen. But in Israel, it's a tremendous barrier. In the U.S., it's also a barrier. As I mentioned earlier, there's limited funds. Now, in the U.S., there's also some private foundations, like the Arnold Foundation, that's invested a great deal in crime research over the last few years. The PNAS study that I talked about, the procedural justice policing and hotspot study that we did in 3 cities, was supported. Most of the support came from the Arnold Foundation, about $2 million. Now, $2 million for support for a randomized trial in criminology, there aren't that many to get that sort of support. And that's a problem. And again, medicine, where there's $45 billion of funding, there are lots and lots of trials, because you don't allow a medicine to be widely used or even to be used unless there's randomized trials showing evidence that the treatment is effective. We need that sort of thinking in the area of crime research. And in Israel, the situation is just extraordinarily difficult for scholars.
So you say basically that it's easier, in a sense, to be in the business of health than in the business of crime prevention, although crime prevention can reduce the hassle for some health scares.
Well, there's a lot of criminologists, economists, and others have moved into the health area. The health area now includes a lot of studies of violence. Another study I spoke about was the National Institutes of Health study that looked at hotspots, at the social context of hotspots, which I'm very interested in. What are they like? What are the informal social controls like at those places? And I realized at the beginning when I wanted to study that I'd never get. I realized it would cost over $3 million to do the kind of study I wanted to do, and there was very little chance of getting that from the National Institute of Justice. And the Arnold Foundation, for example, is policy focused. So I said, where is, I think I mentioned in the talk that it always struck me that there was a famous bank robber, his name was Willie Sutton, I believe. And he was on the Johnny Carson show, nighttime talk show years and years ago. And he was asked, why do you rob banks, Willie? And he said, because that's where the money is. So I always thought, why did you go to the National Institutes of Health for funding on crime, David? Because that's where the money is. No, it's a major look. Until policymakers in places like Israel understand that it's important to have knowledge about what works. It's important to make good decisions based on knowledge. It'll be very, very hard for scholars. And by the way, I think the Israel Science Foundation needs to understand that policy-related research, evaluation research, is as important as basic research in advancing science, and especially the intersection between science and practice.
Yes, and making a real difference in the world. I completely agree with you. David, our last question for today. You mentioned at the beginning that you recommend us to read the Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point book. If we want to read one of your books, or what of your books will you recommend us to start our journey?
Yeah, I wrote a book which was based on a longitudinal study of crime hotspots in Seattle, Washington. And I had support for that work, actually 2 National Institute of Justice grants. And it allowed me to do something, to look in a sort of with large data at the problem of hotspots, where they are, how many of them are, and this sort of things. But anyway, this book is called The Criminology of Place, Street Segments on our Understanding of the Crime Problem. It's published by Oxford University Press. And what I really like about this book, as opposed to some of the other books I've written, is I was able to get Oxford to publish color maps. And early on in my career, I saw that there were these crime hotspots, and around them were cold spots, and there was a lot of visual to it. But I couldn't figure out until this book, and a student of mine actually is now a professor at Temple, who was a geographer, until I got together with her, and we realized we could develop color crime maps of where crime was in the city. And these maps are great in terms of a visual understanding of crime hotspots, the fact that crime hotspots represent a small proportion of the streets in the city, and the fact that they're spread throughout the city across the city map. And also there's strong street by variability, but these color maps are great. Publishers don't like to publish in color. It was a long negotiation. But I think if you want to get an understanding of the idea of crime hotspots, of its importance in terms of understanding and doing something about the crime problem, then The Criminology of Place, Street Segments on the Crime Problem is a great place to start.
Thank you, David. I will put a link to this book at the end of the talk. Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Good luck with your research.
Well, I hope you're scholars doing the kind of work they're doing will be in touch. I saw some overlap, and perhaps we can develop some ideas together.
Definitely. Thank you.
Take care.